Hey, Jordan, we are ready on eScribe and YouTube.
Thanks, Amanda. Okay, good afternoon. I'll go ahead and call the Land Use and Planning Committee to order. Our first item of business, Amanda, can you put up do you have that public participation slide handy? Our public participation remains unchanged. You can find the directions here on screen. You can join the live meeting at ci.missoula.mt.us/webcast, and there you'll find information on how to provide public comment. Our first item of business is roll call.
Anderson? Absent. Becerra? Absent. Contos?
Here.
Hart?
Here.
Hess?
Present.
Jones? Absent. Merritt?
Present.
Ramos?
Present.
Cheryl?
Present.
Basica?
Present.
Von Lossberg?
Here.
And West.
She indicated that she'll be a few minutes late.
Okay.
Okay, great. So we have, looks like we have a quorum then, and we have approval of minutes from December 8th. Oh, and Ms. Jones is present now as well. Are there any changes to those minutes? Seeing none, those will be approved. I'll note for the record that there's no public in attendance, so no public comment. We have one regular agenda item, and this is the Transportation Options Action Plan, and Aaron Wilson's here to present.
Yeah, hi, good afternoon. Thanks for having me. Aaron Wilson, Infrastructure and Mobility Planning Manager for the City of Missoula. And this is largely an update on this project. We haven't done too many presentations on this to council, and we're at a good point to report on what we've done to date. We've kind of been working in the background and continuing on this project for the last 4 or 5 months with Nelson Nygaard, our consultants. And before we get into our kind of the next phase of this project, just felt like a good opportunity to give you all an update on what we've been doing, what we've been hearing, and where we're going with it, and have a couple of kind of questions or touch points that I think it'll be useful to get feedback from council if you have any thoughts on those points. So I have a PowerPoint that I will share so you can all see my screen. So this is an update on our Transportation Options Action Plan. This is something that came out of, or really will be part of our long range transportation plan. That as we were going through that process and spending a lot of time thinking about sort of the hard infrastructure investments and things that we're putting on the ground for transportation. We also wanted to think about all of the programs and activities that we could do to help support those investments. So the first part of my presentation is just a quick touch in on making sure we're clear of what we're talking about when we're talking about transportation options and what this particular plan will address. So when we say transportation options, sometimes we'll refer to this as transportation demand management. There's a whole host of ways we can talk about it, but this is really those kind of education, encouragement, programmatic, maybe what we might call soft infrastructure elements around transportation. So it includes things like education and outreach that might be something like wayfinding or doing direct education to people about different transportation options, doing some direct one-on-one or direct engagement with people about different kinds of multimodal transportation and the options that are out there and how to utilize them. It also includes programs like incentives. So in Missoula, we have zero fare program for transit. That's proven to be very successful in encouraging people to and opening up transit as a viable opportunity and mode that people can take advantage of. Other incentives might be things like bike share memberships. Other communities do that. There are a variety of different incentives and reward programs really intended to get people to try out multimodal transportation, sort of get them over that hurdle of taking the first step to moving beyond a single occupancy vehicle trip. And then other incentives like a guaranteed ride home. So as people are getting used to that mode, if they have an emergency or some other event comes up where they really need to get somewhere quickly or can't rely on the mode that they chose to do that they have a guarantee to be able to do that through a taxi or ride share program. Then there's also the policies. So good example of that is just parking management. How we're managing parking downtown is a good example of a transportation options program. And then there's the technology side. So we have ride matching services or transit apps, or something we're seeing more common in other countries and other cities in Missoula around things like mobility as a service. So you have maybe a one-stop shop app that includes your transit and car share and bike share and all these things sort of in one service that just makes it more convenient. So a lot of technology is happening these days around transportation options and thinking about transportation a little bit differently. And I'll pause here. Sandra, did you have a question that you wanted to jump in? Happy to
Yeah, go
pause.
ahead, Sandra.
So the guaranteed ride home kind of sparked something in my mind. So I've never really thought about this before, but now I have a baby. So what are options with taxis and rideshare programs, like with car seats and whatnot? Like, how does that work?
That's a really good question, and I don't necessarily have a good answer to it, but I don't know that anyone has asked that question before, and so it's something that I appreciate that, because it's something we can look into in terms of some of these other modes like transit, or how is childcare a part of that, or transporting children. Certainly things like how do you manage transporting children comes up a lot. Maybe not.
I would appreciate that. Thank you.
Yeah. So, and I'll talk a little bit about that in relation to what we've heard, but certainly, how you manage transporting children to the various, whether it's to childcare on your way to work or getting them to school or all those various things, are certainly a big part of this this transportation options aspect. This doesn't necessarily have to do with the infrastructure on the ground, like is there a bike lane or not, or is there transit service, but how do you manage those peripheral issues? So that's kind of the general, when we're talking about transportation options, it's these kinds of more programmatic or policy or peripheral issues around the multimodal transportation system, things that would support the infrastructure investments that we're making. So that takes us to this current project of a transportation options action plan. And as I mentioned, this really grew out of the long range transportation plan update that we recently completed, but it's not, certainly wasn't the only place that transportation options focus has been called for in our other policies and planning and documents. So we have the growth policy for the city, calls for accommodating new growth and development through robust transportation options and infrastructure investments, and focusing some on the planning for effects of parking, accessibility, transit. Essentially, how are we planning for a multimodal transportation system? And then in the long range transportation plan, really called for improving convenience and safety of biking and walking, and definitely for transit as the core of our transportation system. Talking about connecting destinations and sustainable travel options. So are we making the right investments in the right places? And then that increasing access to high quality transit in the places where Missoula is growing. We also have, in 2016, we adopted some very ambitious mode split goals. So trying to accommodate future growth in Missoula and our transportation needs through other means other than solely single occupancy vehicle trips. As we look into the future and growth in Missoula and the limits on our infrastructure, we know it's going to be really challenging to accommodate all of that growth solely through single occupancy vehicles, that will just lead to more congestion, more safety issues, and we don't really have the funding or the means to just continually build out all of our roads to accommodate that. And so the core of our focus for the future of transportation in Missoula is trying to build out a fully multimodal transportation system, which includes tripling the number of people biking and walking to work, and quadrupling the share of commute trips that transit serves, and then increases in things like carpool and telecommuting and some of these other maybe more new and emerging modes. Then we also have our common values and goals from the long range transportation plan that a transportation options plan could help support, including things like integrating land use and transportation, building on our community health and economic development and social equity, certainly around sustainability and resilience as we think about climate change and greenhouse gas emissions. And then thinking about safe and secure transportation, and ensuring that our transportation system is accessible, efficient, and well connected. So that's sort of helping to set the policy stage for why we're doing this plan. We also have a lot of existing transportation options programs in Missoula where we're doing this work. We're out there doing some direct programs within the city, which include Missoula in Motion, that does a lot of the education and outreach and encouragement, working with employers and individuals, and doing events and things that really highlight our multimodal transportation system and help to try to break down those barriers to entry into utilizing those modes. Missoula Parking Commission, we may not think of parking as part of a transportation options program, but it comes up in every conversation, and it really is key that how we manage parking influences how people decide to take trips. And so that's a really key part, and Parking Commission is really involved in a lot of the work that we do. And then there are other programs like the Missoula Ravalli TMA that operates Vanpool in the region. We have the University of Montana, ASUM Office of Transportation does a lot of TDM work around campus and students. And then, of course, Mountain Line and other community organizations like Free Cycles, who are out there working to educate the public and try to build awareness of and comfort in a multimodal transportation system. So early on this project, again, thinking about our policies and trying to identify the need for why we're doing this project. And the first and foremost is that, as we all know, Missoula is growing. We're potentially growing at a more rapid pace, and we're seeing that the impacts of that all over Missoula. And we need to think about how we are using our infrastructure as efficiently as possible if we're going to accommodate that growth in a way that is sustainable. And today, the majority of Missoulians still drive alone to work as their commute trip. It's about 70%. Which is good by national standards, but certainly nowhere near our goals for what we want to achieve in order to accommodate that future growth. And so we need to really think about how we're emphasizing making multimodal transportation more accessible to folks. We also, a plan like this relates to issues like our housing affordability, knowing that not just the cost and the challenges of doing development and impacts of things like parking on the ability to do development in a way that's as cost effective as possible, but also just that transportation is the second highest household cost for most households. And so everything we can do to reduce that household transportation cost is increasing the affordability of living in Missoula. And then we have our climate goals of reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Transportation is one of, if not the largest contributor to our greenhouse gas emissions in Missoula. And so anything we can do to shift away from those higher emitting single occupancy vehicle trips into transit and biking and walking or telecommuting, these more sustainable modes. And at the end of the day, we have limited policy tools or regulatory tools to implement those goals through our development code or through other programs that we have available. So that leads us to what we're doing in this project. And there's three main components that we're looking at in terms of where we want to focus on action plans. The first is on our transportation options programs. So looking at opportunities to expand or improve or make our existing programs more efficient, and look at what other communities are doing or ways that we can build on the good work we're already doing to increase the effectiveness of the programmatic side. Then we also want to look at incentives and requirements. So doing review of our things like our development code or employer requirements, things that we can do to bring people to the table around transportation options earlier in the process and make that part of our development review. And as I'll talk about, that doesn't necessarily mean adding a bunch of new requirements. It could be ways to increase incentives in our codes, or change the way we think about some of our transportation requirements a little bit differently to give more flexibility, but have better outcomes in terms of our transportation goals. And then finally, we wanted to look at districts and partnerships. So ways to pool resources in places like downtown or the midtown or around the university where maybe there are groups of employers or developments that can bring resources together and be more effective, and seeing where we have those opportunities and what models are out there across the country to make that more effective. So we're going to do that in a number of different ways as we develop this action plan. So first is sort of our core objectives in terms of how we carry out this work and how we're going to be evaluating potential options. And those include looking at things like equity. So making sure we are thinking about expanding transportation access, particularly for communities who rely on those transportation options as their only means of transportation, or issues like housing affordability. We want to increase flexibility. So we're not looking to just add a bunch of regulations or requirements. We want to look at things like our parking regulations or transportation impacts requirements and make that more flexible for developers so we can achieve these outcomes and make development maybe more easy, but add that flexibility. And then we want it to be relatively easy to implement. We don't want to add a lot of additional bureaucracy, and we want to be reasonable about what's possible in Missoula. So we're looking a lot at, what's the state of transportation in Missoula, what options are out there or easily accessible, and how can we integrate that and make sure that anything we recommend is doable at the end of the day and makes sense. And then we want it to be collaborative and to have clear and objective requirements. So making sure that the outcomes of this are very clear, and even though we're adding some we may be recommending additional flexibility, that the outcome of that flexibility has to be really clear so that we're moving in the right direction. We're also working on sub aspects of this plan are looking at our existing parking requirements and management. So working with the Parking Commission, doing a review of our codes just to see how, as we know, parking is sort of the core of all of this in a lot of ways. So coming up with some recommendations around how we can continue to be more creative around parking. And then finally, we'll have hopefully have a set of priority code amendments that we aren't planning to actually go in and write code that then gets adopted, but have recommendations for how transportation option supportive updates could be integrated into ongoing work that the city is doing around our code updates and developing a unified development ordinance. So opportune time to provide that input as that process is moving forward so it can be integrated and brought forward as part of that full package. So at the end of the day, we hope that this, if we can develop this action plan and implement it, that we will be achieving some community benefits, including attracting and retaining tenants and employees. That we see a lot of trends around the country of people wanting access to more multimodal systems or having more choice in how they get around, or potentially even living car free. And those can be considered amenities that we can offer as a community. We want to try to reduce congestion and traffic and increase the efficiency of our transportation system. So the more people we can support moving into those multimodal options, the less people that will be driving. And so we're retaining that capacity for vehicles and freight and other issues in the future. And then, as I mentioned, promoting sustainability, enhancing equity, and improving community wellness are all goals that we have that we could support through these transportation options. And just creating a more multimodal, connected, and efficient city. And then ultimately, the hope is to decrease development costs by potentially reducing parking requirements, being more efficient with how we address transportation. So pause for a quick second before I move on if there are any quick questions, and then go into some of our committee and stakeholder engagement. If there are any quick questions on what we're doing.
Amber?
I don't know if this is a quick question, but maybe. I'm just curious, like, as you're developing the action plan, are they taking into account maybe more electric charging stations? Is that going to be part of it? And I know passenger rail is not coming tomorrow. It's something I'm really excited about, but I know it is a little further out. But how is that being taken into consideration in this action plan, I guess, both of them?
Yeah, electric vehicle charging, I think, will be a component of this. I think it's certainly part of how we need to think about transportation requirements a little bit differently. I don't know that we will address it well, it's hard to say how we'll address it. I think it relates to a lot of other factors, things like car share and some of the other shared mobility. And then just in terms of how we use space and what kind of spaces we're building that, yeah, I think it's certainly something that we want to try to address, but it's unclear yet exactly how that fits in. But I think I'll get to sort of the next steps in our process, and that might help us. What we're doing over the next couple of months, I think, will help inform how we integrate those. And then passenger rail, it's hard to know when or how that will show up, but certainly having that available would make all of this easier at the end of the day, just in terms of having that kind of transportation accessible in Missoula.
Thanks.
Yeah. All right, so our engagement approach on this project is a little bit different. We're not doing as much full public engagement at this stage in the process because we're really developing an action plan around what we think are best practices and what Missoula is sort of ready to and what's reasonable to accommodate. But we do want to engage some targeted folks. So we have a steering committee that we set up that is a mix of city and private partners, just to help guide us in this work and make sure we're not going down paths that are really unreasonable or have a high chance of being unsuccessful. So that's really our sounding board and are going to give us a lot of good, helpful direction on where we go with recommendations in this plan. We also have a functional work team that is made up of internal city staff that is really our way to evaluate processes, or as we start to develop incentives or requirements or programs, really thinking about our capacity and how it fits into our existing processes and can make sure we're being efficient. And again, thinking about cost, capacity, some of these factors that we want to make sure what we recommend is implementable. And then what I'm going to talk about mostly for the next few minutes is we doing some targeted stakeholder focus group interviews where we are talking to specific individuals around the community to give us ideas for what our opportunities are, what concerns they have, ways that we need to think about transportation options as we go to try to implement them in Missoula. And so we just wrapped up our first round of stakeholder engagement about a month ago. And so we're excited to have that basis of input that will then help us focus our efforts on this next stage of evaluating our opportunities and directions to move forward. So first meeting was in the fall. We'll have a follow-up meeting with our stakeholders and steering committees this winter as we start to develop some draft recommendations and use them as a way to evaluate how implementable those are and whether they're a good fit for Missoula. So I wanted to go over some of the themes that we heard from those stakeholder meetings, because I think it's a really key aspect of how we move forward and what we're trying to address and issues that we might face moving forward. And the first set of themes are around our existing transportation options programs or thinking about those in the future. And we had some really good conversations about what's working well in Missoula and where we may want to focus efforts in the future. And something that we heard in just about every group is that we need to normalize transportation options as part of sort of Missoula's culture, that we are a very car-centric culture. I think people live in Missoula because they want to recreate. People like to get out of town. There's people do own vehicles and will likely continue to own them in the future. And so there is a little bit of a cultural barrier that we may need to get over to achieve some of our goals around multimodal transportation. And so just thinking of ways that we can sort of broadly normalize that as a normal part of our daily transportation decisions, that there is more and convenient ways to get around besides a single occupancy vehicle trip. But also knowing that we're going to continue to have vehicles, people want to get out and recreate, get on the river, that get up to go skiing. And so those are all things that we need to think about. We also good discussions about providing targeted outreach service and training around traveling via different modes. So things like assisting seniors with accessing transit as they age or potentially age out of being able to drive, and getting that training done before they are at the point where they can no longer drive, and getting comfortable about utilizing different modes of transportation. And similarly, reaching out to different types of communities and how we can target that outreach to really be the most effective engagement possible. Heather, do you have a question?
Despite being married to a transportation engineer these years, I just want to emphasize the value that comes from that educational outreach that I know your department has really kind of worked on over a number of years. It wasn't until I personally was, I think, at the county fairgrounds one time for the summer fair, where there was the bike valet. And to be able to interact with your team and actually learn firsthand of like, how do I actually move away from always commuting by car to work to, hey, commuting by bike or walking is actually a viable option. And here are the really good reasons why for our community. So, I say that because we can hear about it and we can read about it, but until we actually experience it, there's no way we really know how we can actually move the needle on these kinds of issues. And so I just would like you to, if possible, double down or triple down on that educational outreach, because until we really hit numbers of real consequence, people will continue to just drive because that is what they experience.
Yeah, no, absolutely. We heard a lot of that during our stakeholder outreach.
It's a really good point, Heather, and I think just from my work at the university, we find that a lot, that a lot of people drive alone because it's the default, and challenging the default. There's nothing wrong with it. It's just it should be a conscious decision rather than the default behavior.
Absolutely. And,
Yeah.
And actually kind of tying this back into Sandy's comment earlier, until, she became a mother and was having to push a child around in a, sorry, I was going to say buggy, but I know that's an outdated word, but a stroller. It's that change of experience that really can help to move us along on this continuum.
Yeah. Thanks. Amber?
Yeah, and I will say, adding to that about Sandy's comments, in travel, I've been in situations where honestly, my kids just weren't in car seats and I got lucky. Building on some of, I think of what Heather was saying, one of the things I've been thinking about is the tourism aspect. I mean, we have a lot of tourists that come here. They probably drive around in circles more because they don't know where they're going, but also having a system that's easy to use. I mean, I go to Boston with some regularity, and the Mass Bay Transit Authority, you can go, I'm trying to get from here to here. And I mean, it'll give you everything. So I'm wondering about promoting this through tourism agencies, even we have giant soccer tournaments that come in, people come in for Grizz games, whatever it is, that is for certain times of the year, a big driving population. And I know it's not like the constant on our roads, like, one of us would be, but just kind of want to put that bug in your ear if it's not already there.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think we heard some of that, and there are good opportunities with that in terms of engaging with hotels or, expanding our outreach or working through the tourism organizations. So trying to move through these a little bit. We had a lot of really good conversations around requirements and incentives, sort of from all aspects here. But there were a lot of themes around good conversations around fees and other incentives. trying to, again, in thinking about trying to make this flexible. So if we have transportation options requirements, thinking about ways that we can make that flexible, like a fee in lieu program, where you can participate in a broader program. Say you're in a district, instead of having to do your own transportation options requirements at your development or business, you could participate in a broader effort, just to make that an easier in for folks as part of the recommendations. Lots of really good ideas about incentives in terms of increasing density or looking at density and floor area ratio kind of calculations, reduced parking requirements, sort of all of those ways that we can use a broader view of how we address transportation to make development, give more options to the developers or businesses in addition to their employees or residents or what comes after that initial development. We also had some good conversations around incentivizing affordable housing. Although I will caveat that with, we got some really good feedback that we should not necessarily just consider, we shouldn't think that reducing car ownership is always a benefit to folks who have a hard time affording housing, that they may have, vehicles may be their most valuable possession, or rely on a vehicle in ways that other folks don't. And so I think we need to be really careful how we think about affordable housing and transportation at the same time that we're trying to reduce those barriers and increase more opportunity to reduce household costs, that we shouldn't just assume all of the parking reductions are going to come on the backs of affordable housing, because there's an equity issue there that we need to think about. I think there was a lot of interest in removing parking minimums, or at least thinking differently about that. Again, with the caveat that that's not going to be true for every development, and there are financial considerations in terms of getting funding for development and affordable housing that may just mean you have to do a certain amount of parking, and we're not going to see every development come in the door with no parking if we were to reduce that. So there's some context there that we need to think about. And then thinking about, bike parking requirements, that there's a lot of work that we can do in our code just to make that a little bit more easy and streamlined and make more sense. And then thinking about implementation, that we don't want to be adding any additional barriers to development and growth. We just want to be thinking about how we do it differently to get to those outcomes that we're looking for. So really thinking about the implementation side of it and keeping it manageable and not just increasing bureaucracy for the sake of achieving our goals. And then corridors and partnerships, again, a lot of opportunity here, but looking at, heard a lot about good ideas around connecting, developing corridors and districts, things like downtown or the Brooks corridor, or around the university, even with the Swift-Duquesne area west of Reserve Street, that there may be a lot of opportunities there to build on some of this. Thinking about paid parking districts outside of downtown, that knowing that parking is, free, easily accessible, widely available parking is one of the drivers of drive alone trips. That if you can easily find parking, there are some trade-offs there in terms of cost to provide that parking versus the ease of being able to drive and park. And then we heard a lot of conversations about parking downtown being more dynamic, and thinking about peak hour or doing hour or daily leases as opposed to monthly, or being just more creative and responsive to the demands of parking to really maximize the use of what we have already, and rather than require just building a whole lot of new parking. And then thinking about district-based and daily parking downtown. And we even had some really good conversations about park and rides. Could a developer help fund a park and ride outside of downtown, knowing that there's good transit connections, and then that would be their contribution, instead of building more parking downtown, which has sort of cascading benefits of reducing the number of people who are having to drive through on Brooks or other places. They could park, ride transit. We have good transit service, and as we get other mobility modes, that could be an option where you're contributing to sort of a broader parking strategy rather than just individual parking on your site. And then some other broader ideas, and it shouldn't be surprising, but it was encouraging to hear in literally every conversation we had, the connection of land use and transportation was brought up, that we have to have a good good land use development system that brings services closer together, that gives people housing options where they work. Childcare, so Sandra, that came up quite often of, people need good access to things like childcare on these routes. If you're taking transit, you need a good, easy way to get your child to daycare or to school on your way to work. And, people don't feel like they can do that because they have to go an hour out of their way on transit to do that. And then it just is no longer viable. So really thinking clearly about how we integrate our land use, different land uses, and how that relates to the transportation system. If we're going to be effective in our transportation goals, we have to do those other things. And then just reducing safety barriers, making sure people feel safe and comfortable. Really wanted to look at staff capacity and funding to make sure that we're recommending implementable strategies, that we're not putting an undue burden either on city staff or on developers or employers or other folks who are having to participate in these programs. And then we had some good conversations about unintended consequences, which I think is a good reminder for us to think about how these things could play out and maybe have impacts that we were not expecting. Like there was a good comment about for promoting telecommuting or other kinds of trips for downtown, or if we're leading something that the higher wage earners are leaving downtown for whatever reason, that has a cascading impact on retail and restaurant businesses, folks who rely on those employees downtown to support their businesses. And so we want to be careful about how those kinds of external impacts as we're developing these recommendations. So next steps, we're going into that was what we heard from stakeholders. It gave us a really good foundation to work on and what we want to do moving forward. And that brings us to our next step, which is doing sort of a best practices peer evaluation for what might be appropriate for Missoula and what are other communities doing that are innovative and that we can draw on. So rather than just doing 3 or 4 comparable city, like sort of deep dive peer evaluations, we've decided to approach it more from a topical framework. So thinking about key questions and then looking for communities that are doing those kinds of things well, and then trying to draw lessons from those. So doing less of a deep dive on individual communities and more of a deep dive on specific topics. So thinking about, what is the strategy and why we would do it? How does it work? Thinking about implementation details. How are other communities implementing these? What challenges have they faced, and what has that meant for them? And how can we learn from that? Thinking about metrics for success. So we don't want to just implement programs and then move on. We want to be able to make sure they are effective and we're achieving the goals we set out to achieve. So how are other places tracking those goals and measuring their success? And then looking at, essentially peer examples from 1 to 3 or 4 cities for each of these topic areas, and developing a summary that we can then use to develop our own recommendations based on this peer evaluation. And this is an area where I think could use, if you have any feedback on sort of the specific areas that we're looking at, and if these seem like the appropriate ways to move forward for Missoula in terms of topics or the communities that we're evaluating. So one topic area is transportation option requirements. So we know a lot of what we can do through programs and sort of our own encouragement and outreach, but oftentimes those requirements, one can give us an opportunity to evaluate our own, what we're requiring of developers and create that more flexible and result-oriented, outcome-oriented approach. But again, looking at what types of transportation options requirements are out there, where they're employer-based or just new developments, looking at potential for point-based transportation option plans. And there's a number of communities that we've identified that we can look to that are doing these kinds of things. And so I think that's one where be really curious sort of what city council is thinking in terms of interest in looking at our requirements and thinking broadly about adding some transportation options specific, sort of multimodal requirements into our regulatory code updates. Then parking is another big one that we wanted to look at and evaluate. So thinking about shared parking districts, removal of minimums. Communities like Buffalo, New York, or South Bend, Indiana have essentially gotten rid of citywide parking minimums. So they now just have parking maximums. And those are both citywide. So I think we have we can learn a lot from those communities and how they've approached that and what's working. And then just some more creative dynamic parking management, like transitioning from monthly to daily parking leases or other strategies. And then we also wanted to look at behavior change programs, which is a lot of what we're already doing, but some opportunities for targeted outreach or employer-based program awareness and building on the capacity of those programs. And then the final one is around, we're calling transportation options, which is sort of this whole project, but it's really focused more on like what modes are available, like things like car share or park and ride, sort of those services that help facilitate this kind of work. And there's some really good examples out there. Communities like Burlington, Vermont, which is very similar to Missoula, similar climate. And they've been doing some really innovative work around car share and some other transportation aspects. So I think we've got good things we can learn from those communities. So with that, our next steps, we've wrapped up our stakeholder focus groups. We're moving into that peer evaluation and identifying our issues and opportunities. That's really going to be the foundation for how we develop our recommendations. And we'll be using our steering committee and our stakeholder focus groups to really evaluate and vet those so that when we come forward with our action plan and what we think our recommended paths forward are, we've vetted those and we feel like we will be bringing forward something that can be successful in Missoula. And so the goal is to have this wrapped up by the summer, to have our recommendations for transportation options, regulatory recommendations, parking recommendations, all of that wrapped up into a plan that we can present and hopefully then get to work on. So the last piece that may want a little bit of feedback, hopefully we have time, is just thinking about how we evaluate each of these options as we go forward. So I've talked about most of these early on in the presentation, but again, thinking about making sure it's the right size for Missoula and appropriate, collaborative, flexible, but then having clear and objective outcomes that flexibility is geared around, and that we're being equitable and thinking about equity in the work that we do. And at the end of the day, the cost to implement, there's always a cost, whether it's an opportunity cost or a financial one. So we want to make sure that is reasonable and relates to effectiveness and having good outcomes. So that is all I have to present. Again, I think having any feedback around those topic areas, making sure that those are appropriate things that we should be moving forward on, general interest from council on the different types of transportation options, actions that we could take. And then any other evaluation criteria that we may want to use or as we move forward with this, how should we be parsing out what we recommend versus what we don't? Or just any other comments on the project? Happy to hear any of that.
Thanks, Aaron. Heidi, I saw your hand for a moment. Did you want to?
I have a couple of comments
Okay.
that they don't probably fit neatly into any of those buckets. But one thing that I wanted to mention is I think it would be really interesting to pair parking reductions and increased bike parking with also maybe requiring shower facilities in commercial, especially commercial buildings or buildings that are going to hold, large amounts of employees. I recently had a conversation with someone who described that there's two kinds of jobs, like the ones you take the shower before you go and then one where you take the shower after. And I think encouraging people to bike, for a job where they have to be, not sweaty, I think showers are pretty important. And then I just wanted to kind of echo that equity piece too. I think that often maybe low-income folks especially are in jobs that don't necessarily mesh well with our bus schedules, which can be problematic. And I think we're addressing as a community by expanding our service. But there is an importance for cars, especially if you're stuck working in jobs that maybe are at night or at weird swing shifts. So we can't, ignore that. So I think that's it.
Thanks. And I'm not sure, Amber or Heidi, who's running the next committee, but can I go a few minutes long? Okay. Thanks. So Heather and then Sandra.
Thanks, Jordan. Aaron, I think I've learned a great deal from you for the last 4 years, and I just really, really appreciate that. And to that end, I think it's helpful for this body to kind of keep in mind too that transportation costs can either remain roughly 10% of our general budget, or it can get bigger. And if we keep building our way out of what we're trying to do in terms of infill, transportation costs can easily erode or eat more up of our general budget. And I think it's important to keep that in mind, because from a rule of thumb perspective for a personal household, transportation shouldn't be more than 10% either. And yet we have a lot of folks where that has grown to be a much larger percentage on top of the housing problem that they also face. So I think being able to look at this and think creatively of how we can reduce our transportation costs overall. Number one is to make sure that we really focus on infill and try and reduce as much greenfield development as we possibly can, and be mindful of that. Because, Aaron, I think last time I checked 3 years ago, per linear foot to put in our roads, curbs, and utilities is $1,000 per linear foot. And that was 3 years ago. So one block is $500,000. And very expensive infrastructure. So just be mindful.
Thanks, Heather. Sandra, and then Julie.
Thanks. With the baby on board in mind, with buses, last year I rode the bus just to, see what riding the bus is like. And, it seems pretty straightforward. You get on the bus, but there's a lot of questions like, what if you have a bike? What if you have a stroller? What if you have a wheelchair? So I don't know if you have any of this on the Mountain Line website, but how to ride the bus might be really informative for folks.
Yeah, certainly education was a big piece of what we've talked about, and something that I think we'll be looking at how we can better integrate and get that word out.
Great, thanks.
Yeah, it's a great point. New rider anxiety. I think it's a real thing for sure. Julie.
Thanks. I just want to say thank you to Aaron. As always, you have got your eye on the big picture, how these things all come together and affect each other. You are just a great asset to the city. And I just want to say thank you for over the years, all your very informative and well thought out and easy to listen to presentations. like Heather said, I've learned a ton, and I just appreciate how much you guys think about all of the things outside of the asphalt that we drive on or ride on. Thanks.
Yeah, well, thank you. And hopefully this is a good last, for those of you departing council, this is a good last presentation that's made it more positive or something to think about.
And you're always welcome to come and be in the audience and watch these great presentations.
Yeah, or give me a call whenever if you want to talk about them in other capacities. I think there's a lot of work to be done on these. So
Appreciate that.
Well, we're out of time, so I want to wrap us up. I want to echo what Julie just said, Aaron. I think that this is great work, and it's always a pleasure to see what good work your department puts out. So thank you for updating us, and we'll look forward to the next steps.
Great, well, thank you. And sorry I talked a little bit too long. And good luck on the rest of your day.
That's all right. Thanks, Aaron. And I'll just note for the record that there's no public here for public comment. So without anything further, we'll be adjourned. Thanks, everyone.